Good. So today, this lecture, I will explore the intersection of trade, sustainability, and governance or climate governance. And I call this a tride or integrated stride. This has become one of the most dynamic and then also a contested area of international economic law. And so the discussion, we want to examine how the global trading system, and especially we touch on the after, has evolved in order to meet these demands of environmental stewardship and climate resilience, while we maintain the core objectives of our economic integration. We have to develop, we have to trade, but we have to trade in the context of global responsibility, stewardship to the environment, and to other demand of the international economic system. Now, this is a quotation I took one of my papers published by Macmillan in a book. International climate law and governance have evolved with many critical issues at play on compliance and accountability. To address such issues, climate change has been tackled with global legislation, their treaties, protocols, and even policies, with a view that we address the climatic crisis. It has been observed that good climate governance has a direct impact on sustainability and development. So, either to bring this as my conclusion or as my introduction, I want us to have this when we're exploring or discussing anything, the intersection of these three key concepts, which we cannot do away with anytime we want to discuss global trade or the economic system. So this is my outline that I will be following, God willing. If I can touch on all, that'll be nice. Today they said I don't have much time. So let's look at these conceptual foundations. It's academic. So as an author, you have to explore on right from certain, because we know social concepts have definitions that cannot be limited. So anytime you have to conceptualize your background of what you intend to say so that people understand you from that background. So now international trade has been defined yesterday. Professor Walid explained this concept to us. So it's an exchange of goods, services, and capital across national borders. And traditionally, international trade is focused on economic growth, and market access and tariffs reduction. When we talk about international trade, specifically international trade, a concern of international economic law or international trade in the global system is basically to have or to explore market access, remove barriers, whether tariff barriers or non-tariff barriers, so that we can have growth or economic development or global economic development. So what is sustainability, or what we call sustainable development? Now, we know the Blatner definition of sustainable development that has become the cliche or the foundation for all. In 1987, in the paper or a report called Our Common Future, after which was published by the World Commission on Environmental Development, it defines sustainable development as a development that meets the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own demands. That's what we call the Brundtland definition, and that is a common definition that you have, from the known to the unknown. Now, this definition shows a kind of a balanced integration between economic advancement, social inclusion, environmental stewardship in decision making. Now, if you look at these two definitions, or this definition, I identify two core ideas. If you look at this definition, the first idea is How do we meet our essential needs in this present time? We have to eat, we have to live. We cannot think about the future without also thinking about us. But the concern here is the needs of the poor, in our age. How we can suffice, how we can explore the environment, explore our development, so that the needy, the poor, the vulnerable can have access to natural resources and be sufficient. At the same time, we should also recognize, whilst we are exploring for our needs and our sustenance and survival in present times, we must also recognize the limit on environmental, concerns or environmental needs, that constrain present and future development. So, sustainable development, basically, and I'm going to take you to the details of it, is to meet our present conditions, present needs, whilst we make provision for future generation to meet their own needs. So what we've came to meet, how was it years ago, 100 years, 200 years ago? The historians here, the archaeologists here, how have you explored to see what we enjoy now? How was the weather condition, what was the climatic condition of Tanzania years ago as compared to what we have now? And yesterday in the night, I said I would love to live here forever because of the environmental condition here. Now, let me take you to a bit of background, what we call the sustainable framework. Now, if you look at these diagrams, now, we used to talk about sustainable development or economic development based on 4 thematic areas or variables. Of course, we have to develop economically, so we used to talk about economic development, which ensures prosperity and economic growth in a sustainable manner. So we always say that let's get economic needs whilst we ensure that the future does not lose its value too. And of course, we have to also develop socially, our social interactions that promote equity, well-being, and quality of life for all. So not each one for himself and God for us all. We are each other's keeper. And that is African value. We believe in the extended family system, right? We care for each other. We love each other. We shake our hands. We know each other's name. We are called by name. We fraternize in a way that makes us feel happy, So if you're African, you're Ghanaian, you may not have money, but the next day when you wake up in the morning, somebody asks you, how are you? That social interaction even keeps you going. You are not lonely. Somebody asks you, how is your child? How is he doing? These are part of development. Holistic development includes social interactions, right? Then the political interaction, which fosters inclusive governance, particularly participation and accountable institutions. And political values or political variable is not just what we call democracy. Our traditional institutions having, democratic, however you want to define democracy. Our governance system, for our traditional values, traditional leaders, and our ancestral leadership is a political one. In the churches, and various religious organizations that we belong to, there's a political hierarchy or structure there. Then the environmental hand of it. So at the center, we score these sustainable development. Good. But at the Rio de Janeiro conference, he said, no, let's redefine sustainable development. Sustainable development, yes, we can talk about economic development on its own, talk of each of these one on its own. All of them would entail some sort of concerns. But there is a missing link. The missing link is that all of these 3, the common variable is the environment. So now we talk about sustainable development, we have to put the environment at the center. If we want to develop now, meet our needs now, and also meet the needs of the future generation, then the environment must be of a concern to us. So the environment is a core variable. So when we talk about economic development, it affects the environment. You can't develop your economy without affecting the environment. So when you are doing your economic planning, everything, put the environment as a factor. It's a key. When you talk about social development, it must also factor the environment. When you talk about political development, you must factor the environment. So in the present discussion of sustainable development, the environment must be at the center. Because as they say, if the last tree dies, the last man dies. I'm sure you know that when the last tree dies, the last man dies. So the environment must be of concern to us when we're doing development discussions. So trade is economic function. It's as a social dimension, and even political decisions affect that. But in order to have it holistically, the environment must be at the center. So now we're considering development, or what you call sustainability. The framework has shifted from this conceptual understanding to this conceptual understanding. That now we have to put the environment at the center of every development discussion that we want to discuss. They say I should not ask questions, I should not do so, so I should move on. So in sustainability in modern trade regimes, what are the concepts that we normally talk about? We are familiar with what they call the green industrial policy, which is a global shift towards low carbon development strategies and renewable energy subsidies. So within this sustainability discussion, especially related to trade regimes, if you look at all the international economic law and the conceptual issues, one of the things that is common that you find is what you call the green industrial policy, which is a shift or an energy shift towards strategic development. Then we felt the common just transition. Just transition ensures climate measures that account for developmental inequalities and social equity. And anytime we talk of justice or just, then the consideration is on the vulnerable. It's on those that are at the receiving end. How are we able to balance the acts to make sure that whilst we are transitioning, developing, in this age of energy exploration and other things, we make sure that we are not going to leave behind or let the development trajectory affect those that are poor or those that are vulnerable in society. That is what we call just transition. Now let's go to the last concept, or the second concept, the last one in the triad, which is climate governance. In fact, the discussion of climate governance, we begin with what we call climate law. I mean, it's also a branch of public law that's governs state-to-state resolution of conflict bordering on depletion and misuse of natural resources and endowment. So, to talk of climate governance, we must situate it within the concept or the framework or the broader topic of climate law, which is also an area of law that you can pursue, in international economic law. So, when we talk of climate governance, we are talking about the institutional arrangements. Because we are talking about governance now. Now we're moving to the law as a public governance issue, to climate governance. So, climate governance. Sure, it has been affected by climate change. So, when we talk about climate governance, we are talking about the institutional arrangements, the processes, and the the norms that concern or are used to make climate decisions at the global, national, or the regional level. So that is climate governance. So how are policies and how are institutions process the values that are relevant for global, regional, and national as values on the climate. So when you talk about global governance, climate governance, it consists of norms, like I said, institutions and treaties. An example that we're going to look into detail is the United Nations Framework Covenant on Climate Change, the Paris Agreement, the Kyoto Protocol, and so on and so forth. These are some of the institutional designs and norms that address climate change through two words. Take notes: adaptation and mitigation. Now, when we're discussing climate change, climate governance, these are the two key words or concepts that comes or plays out: mitigation and adaptation. Now, then we have what we call climate regulation. These are legally binding rules and standards designed to mitigate greenhouse gas emissions and manage risks. And these are naturally or specifically domestic laws, domestic laws that are enforceable and binding. And that plays out either in national laws or some binding treaties. And because treaties, we know the nature of treaties, but we're not talking about that. But climate regulation is at key, especially when it comes to national regulation. And climate justice, which is also a kind of a normative dimension that focuses on fairness. I've stated that again when you talk about climate justice, just transition, equity, and the disproportionate burden borne by the global south. Now, so let's look at the historical evolution. Now, we know the GATT 47, which is the mother of the present WTO. GATT 47 had about 38 provisions, and we know the challenges that the GATT 47 had in implementation, basically about dispute resolution, which was absent, and what you call the positive consensus issues that did not allow the GATT 47 to survive until the Uruguay rounds came and gave birth to the GATT 94, which was also called WTO law. And the GATT, which was the foremost international economic law, which dealt with trade, the issue of environmental concerns was largely absent, or consideration was absent. And that was one of the key issues that affected the implementation of the GATT 47. Like I said, the GATT stands for General Agreement on Trade and Tariffs. So these were the core issues or some of the key defects of the GATT 47, and transitioned onto the GATT 94, which we also called, and we called the GATT 94, obviously because if you look at the framework, all the provisions of the GATT 47 were brought to the GATT, the WTO law, or the GATT. Let me welcome my professor, my lecturer from University of Pretoria, and also from Ghana. Yes. Yes. So when you see me talk trade confidently, then credit to Professor Kwapa, who taught me WIPO laws on the IP at the University of Pretoria when I was doing my TIRA. Welcome. This is your small boy. So please, have mercy. So, from GATT 47, to the WTO framework, under the Marrakesh Agreement, one of the foremost deficiencies was that it lacked any provision or consideration on the environment. And so the paradigm started shifting in the 90s, during the rounds of the Uruguay rounds, discussions, and other forums. Until 92, so that is prior to the WTO formation, the current WTO formation, at the Rio Earth Summit, which marked the beginning of integrating sustainability into trade governance. Like I said, where the discussion of sustainability became key in this trade that I've explained. So we now have transitioned. In the 90s, the discussions on the environment has become key. So we cannot talk about trade or anything economic law without considering the issue or the pivotal role of the environment. So in 92, one of the significant issue or notes that we have to take here that the summit, the Earth Summit in 92, did not just start the global trade governance. It set the legal and institutional architecture within which Africa still negotiates its place in the climate change, climate regime. So this is where, and not just Africa, the global South particularly, that is where the foundations or we had the legal wherewithal or the legal and institutional architecture within which we negotiate all our climate discussions. Now contemporary integration, that is the modern trade, which is addressing labor standards, environmental protection, and climate resilience. So today, if you look at all modern trade agreement treaties, and we look at the AFTA in particular, you find out that environment is key. Environment is key. And you find out in the preamble of most of the treaties or the understanding, you find that environment is key, is mentioned. So this is how the historical evolution where trade, climate, and then sustainability is discussed. Now, the Rio Earth Summit, which was formerly known as the United Nations Conference on Environment Development, was a landmark global meeting that was held in the Rio de Janeiro that fundamentally reshaped international environmental law and sustainable development. And it brought together almost about 170 countries, nation states, with thousands of stakeholders to look at the tension or the issues of development and environmental protection. So like I said, we cannot talk of development and leave the environment behind. Environment is key in all of the handles that I talked about. And this summit produced several foundational instruments underlined that still underpin or guides global climate governance today. And that is what we're going to look at. Now, one of them is, I mentioned before, the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. And this framework is the basic legal framework for international climate negotiations, which includes principles like the common but differentiated responsibility, which I will keep on repeating. And sometimes it's called a common but differentiated responsibility and respective capabilities or capacities. So what is the central aim of the UNFCCC? The UNFCCC was to destabilize the greenhouse gas concentration in the atmosphere at a level that prevents dangerous human interference with the climate system. And it has served, like I said before, as a primary global legal framework that guides climate governance. What are the key features of this framework or instrument? It's a framework convention which set the broad principles, like I said, the primary objectives and the commitments rather than a binding emission target. So it's a foundational instrument upon which other instruments, other discussions or negotiations is based. It also has a differentiated responsibility because it recognizes the principle of common, like I've said, the CBDR, between developed and developing countries. And this differentiated responsibility is key looking at the development. At any time where there's a discussion, where there's a negotiation of parties or state parties, then the dichotomy of their development level has to come in. And it's recognized that at all times, the discussion is not an arm's length discussion, because there are those that come in as developed countries, rich, endowed countries, who we'll talk about have already, the discussion, the debate that have already explored environments and have gained a lot, and have to contribute or have to have a kind of a limit to further exploration as to the developing countries. And so the debate, this age-old debate of sovereignty and natural resource, has been there. Remember the Cabo, principle, and so on and so forth. So then we also have Conference of the Parties, which is a governing body where member states meet annually to negotiate and renew progress. And it's also, like I said, it's a foundation for later agreement that is under future, because it underpins or underscores or set up the major climate instruments like the Kyoto Protocol and the Paris Agreement, which were later instruments that have been developed based on the UNFCCC. What is the relevance to trade and sustainability? What is the relevance of this instrument, the mother instrument, to trade and sustainability? So you see, the UNFCCC is about climate. So how does it intersect with trade and then sustainability? So this is done, or the intersection with trade comes through carbon pricing and border adjustment measures, i.e., tariffs and non-tariff barriers when discussing trade or negotiating on trade. And then climate-related subsidies and green industrial policy, and then standards affecting international market access. So in discussing trade and sustainability, these frameworks come to play because to set the basis and the standards for which the discussion is done, where to give and where to take in the discussion. Two, the second instrument is what we call the Convention on Biological Diversity, CBD, which focuses on conservation, sustainable use, and equitable sharing of biological resources. The third instrument is the United Nations Convention on Combat Desertification, which was later developed to address land degradation, particularly relevant to Africa. And D, what we call the Agenda 21. That's a blueprint for sustainable development at global, national, and local level. And that is where the Agenda 21 is where the issue of sustainability came to play or was rooted in Agenda 21. And of course, the Real Declaration on Environment and Development, which introduced key principles such as the precautionary principle, polluter pays. We've heard this principle mentioned over and over again. The root of it, or where it started from, is under the Real Declaration on Environment and Development, and public participation, which is also a governance issue. Why is this a matter for Africa? Well, why it matters for Africa, especially on the UNFCCC? Why does it matter for Africa? The Real Summit entrenched equity-based principle. Like I've said, anytime we're talking about equity or justice, then the consideration at the back of our mind is the vulnerable. And of course, between the South and the North, it's right. There's no debate about that Africa is mostly vulnerable or, quote unquote, poor. You may not be able to debate this. So it matters for Africa because majority of the world's population, the poor of the world's population, can be found in the South, and Africa in particular. That is why this matters to us. So that whatever provision or the entailment of that instrument must be of concern to us. And especially, like I said, the CBDR, right, it's very important for us. And that remains central to Africa climate diplomacy, which means is that anytime Africa is negotiating on climate governance, climate issues, the concern is, or our focus, or our trump card is on the CBDRCC. Sorry, the CBDR, and sometimes CBDR. So this also positions sustainable development as a legal and policy bridge between environmental protection and economic growth, a tension that continues to define African policy responses today. Today, at various UN forums, trade conferences, international conferences, Africa's position is to debate or to argue for the rights to have a kind of exploration of the environment to a certain extent. And this is hinged, or the motivation is on the fact that we have a framework that talks of sustainable development, which put the environment at the center of development. And so we cannot touch any development, we cannot develop when we do not touch the environment. But how far can we touch the environment? The global north, or so-called developed nations, are pushing for a limit on emissions and environmental degradation and so on and so forth. Can we be at par? Can we have the same limit of environmental exploration? Africa's trump card is to say that we are relying on the CBDR, in order that we can also develop to a certain extent. Then we can come on at the same level, whether that will ever happen, and then we can take the discussions from there. But at least there is a kind of a metric or standard or a level that we can explore the environment. That is Africa's trump card. So in all this, I put this into what they call the tried integration, which for me gives a deeper integration of climate governance, environmental law, and trade regulation. And you will see there's a kind of interaction. The climate governance has to have an interface with environmental law. Basically, environmental law has to have an interface with trade regulation. But you will see that trade regulation and then climate law have a kind of policy coherence and mutual reinforcement. They cannot do with each other. So when you talk about trade regulation, you must talk about climate governance. Talk climate governance, it will have effects on trade regulation. So under no circumstances can you take one out of the other. The three concepts interact or interface at a certain point. And that is how I try to have this, what I call the tried integration. So you see that the role of environmental law here, it comes to play. Now, the role of international economic law basically comes to play, and it promotes doctrinal space for environmental measures through frameworks like the Marrakesh Agreement, which gave birth to the WTO, and particularly Article 20 of the Marrakesh Agreement, which gives a place for environmental law. So even the Marrakesh Agreement, the WTO agreement, put the environment at a very frontal position. So that moves away from the GATT 47 challenge. Now, what are the constraints? Challenges arise when climate policies, example, carbon pricing, emission standards, conflict with trade and investment obligations. This is where the problem is. Now, we are saying that when we are discussing international economic law, particularly WTO law and trade negotiations and international trade system, the focus should be on environments, as the Marrakesh Agreement provides. But again, there's also a challenge when you're talking about carbon pricing and emission standards, because under any developments, production, manufacturing, industrial production, when you bring carbon pricing and then emission limits, the argument is that you are limiting production and trade. How much you can produce, how much you can trade. So that's where the challenge is. Even though we want to talk about the environmental concerns, and the WTO is for the International Economic Law, and the WTO talks about environmental issues, but the WTO is to promote trade, removal of tariffs and barriers, especially non-tariff barriers, including technical barriers. And technical barriers entails carbon pricing and emission standards. So how do you balance the act here? It's a challenge for international economic law. Now, let's move to the stakeholders in trade and this triad. trade, climate sustainability, and governance. So we see various stakeholders with various interests and various roles to play when we're talking about trade, climate sustainability, interface. And identified a number of them. Governments or states, we have businesses and the private sector, industry, civil society, and the NGOs have various roles. Consumers, consumers, we cannot take them away from. Financial institutions and investors, international financial institutions, local communities and indigenous people, like I said. In all these, particularly, when talking about sustainability particularly, we're looking at the position of local communities and indigenous people. I did my PhD in business and human rights, and I looked at the UNGPs. I'm sure you have heard of UNGPs, United Nations Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights. And I look at that in the oil and gas sector in Ghana and how the activities affect the environment, livelihood, and so on and so forth. And so position that how the UNGPs, because it's a soft law, a non-binding principle, most countries have not even heard of it or even ratified. So I look at it in the Ghanaian perspective, from Ghanaian perspective, to see how Ghana may adopt the key principles, protect. What are the three pillars? Protect, prevent, and remedy. Protect, prevent, and remedy. These three pillars. So indigenous people are very important when you're discussing development. We can never discuss development, especially when we talk about what we call the right to development, which is also a protocol. The UN accepts the protocol, the 1986 protocol on the right to development. And Africa particularly, when we talk about right to development, Africa had it, and that of course informed the UN protocol on the right to development. And the right to development, we put the vulnerable or the indigenous people at the center. Then academia and research institutions, like most of us who are here, and this institution particularly, the African International, example of it is this institution. Workers and labor unions, trade organizations and agreements, and then, of course, international organizations as we find them. So these are the key stakeholders that we have to always look into the activities. And at international forums, international discussions, all these players are brought together. It's not just about lawyers and the legal fraternity or trade experts who are consulted or whose views are brought to the. We need to have all of these people usually represented by certain organizations. We know that a lot of NGOs represent the interests of these people. So they come together in negotiating issues. That's why I said hundreds of people at the Rio de Janeiro conference were there, basically to discuss and so that they will put the issues of each of the stakeholders on the front burner for consideration. So I've looked at them individually here, but that's what I've presented holistically here. Now, what are the legal bases for integrating sustainability into trade regimes? What are the legal bases? How do we justify that we must integrate sustainability into trade regimes? Like I've said, if you look at the WTO architecture, so at any discussions, any forums, if you look at the WTO architecture in the Marrakesh Agreement, like I said, the preamble is very clear, and it identifies sustainable developments, and that's why I put in quotes. It doesn't run because, like I said, the discussion of sustainable development was prior to the Marrakesh or the WTO final rounds of the Uruguay rounds, that culminated in the WTO or the GATT 94, and that took notice of the challenge that we have with the GATT 47, which did not have environmental concerns. So it took into consideration. And like I said, because before the WTO Marrakesh Agreement was finally framed, the discussion on environment had started in the 90s. So they had nothing to do, especially because the WTO was also on trade. And so we cannot, or they couldn't do away with environmental. And it's basically identifies sustainable development or sustainability and environmental protection as a core objective of WTO. So this is when we are discussing environmental concerns in trade. We have the basis. The legal basis is that WTO even has it in the legal framework. So when we look at GATT, the Article 20 exceptions, like I said, the primary mechanism for justifying, so there are exceptions, justifying environmental trade measures is to rely on these provisions. So, like I said, development cannot be done without exploring the environment. At what price? At what limit? So, if Tanzania want to have a kind of, a development that will entail exploring certain limits of the environment, it has to have justification, especially when it's relying on the WTO treaty architecture. So the measures that are necessary for exploring the environment beyond certain limits, that measure should be necessarily to protect human, animal, or plant life or health. Right? So, for instance, if there is an ecosystem that you want to explore, basically for example, to construct road, to a hospital or certain infrastructure, you must be sure that by exploring that environment, you are doing that, to protect human life, animal life, or plant life, or health. Then basically, if you're able to justify that, that exception will apply. And then Article 22G, with measures relating to the conservation of exhaustible natural resources. So these justifications allow for a certain limit of exploration of the environment, right? Now let's also look at some jurisprudential developments. Basically, case law, WTO cases that have also given justification. So, under the interpretative lens, we look at from the appellate body, often uses the Marrakesh preamble, like I've said, to interpret trade obligations via Article 31 of the VCLT. Then, key cases, we have heard, you see the U.S. gasoline and the U.S. shrimp case, which established that environmental measures are permissible if applied non-discriminatory and in good faith. In good faith. One is not just for expropriation, it's not just for exploitation, it's not just for discriminating, it's not just for Aryan, like the professor said, protection of Aryan property. If you want to expropriate an Aryan property, what we call investment, there should be justification. So this key was, and we have the Chapeau test, which says that measures must not constitute disguised protectionism. Disguised protectionism, where we come under the issue of, we are protecting the environment, we are exploring the environment, but it is just to protect national, investors or nationals as against foreign investors. The Chapeau is really give the test or the standard or arbitrary disposition. Then what are they emerging from the legal framework, from the GATT or the WTO framework to the jurisprudential issues I talk about it? What are the emerging soft law and global linkages? Like I said, the Royal Declaration of 92, which introduced key guiding principles, basically precautions and common, like I've said, the CBDR, the common but differentiated responsibility and respective capabilities. Now, Agenda 2030, which has also come, we are closer to it, which positions Sustainable Development Goals, SDGs, as a global governance imperative. We know Agenda 2030 we are getting close to it, right? And then climate treaties are all over. The UN FCCC and Paris agreements impose mitigation obligations that increasingly necessitate trade-related domestic measures. And of course, if you look at the UNGPs, like I mentioned, which is also key on environmental issues, protect, respect, and remedy. What are the legality of specific measures? Now, these measures, what are its position? And we look at the carbon adjustment mechanism, which has become one of the pillars or one of the trump cards or one of the negotiating, shape cards for many of the international climate governance, system. Legality depends on consistency with GATT's non-discrimination rules, the MFN and the national treatment, and Article 20, like I said, exceptions. Equilibrium, which must be non-discriminatory and no more trade restrictive than necessary under the WTO technical standards. Mind you, note that we are discussing this framework under international economic law. And international economic law, we are talking about WTO law in this particular instance because it would trigger down to the after institution. Then environmental restrictions, which generally is justifiable if scientifically supported and aimed at legitimate environmental objectives. So when we were exploring any of these instruments or mechanisms and climate governance, these are the legalities that you must consider. So let's look at the climate governance frameworks that influence trade policy. Of course, we've already mentioned this, almost everything here, so I've listed them and particularly what they do. So in the climate governance framework, basically that you can use as your chips, your bargaining chips, or consider to explore when you're talking about trade policy. And like I said, we cannot delineate trade policy discussions from climate and sustainability requirements or obligations. So I've already mentioned we've talked about the UNFCCC structure established as a core framework for global climate cooperation. I've talked about the CBDRC principle, which recognizes the common but differentiated responsibilities and respective capabilities. And let me take a little time to explain this because I think I've raised this. Now, the CBDR is conceived on the principle that all of us have a common environmental concern. If there is a challenge of environmental issue, maybe emissions in Tanzania, you cannot restrict its effect on the neighborhood countries or even beyond. We have the same challenge, the same economic challenge, the same political challenge. When there is war, when there is political upheaval, migrations and border disruptions affect neighborhood and affect the economy of the whole continent. We all suffer, right? Resources of countries are put together. Military and security agencies are put from various countries to go and fight it or mitigate it. We have a common concern, especially when it comes to the environment, right? When we have economic concern, migrations, famine, and other things, it affects all of us. And when there's economic concern, famine, hunger, and other things, it also affects the environment because exploration became heavier on the side where these vulnerables are. They will explore everything, survival of the fittest. So you see that it's one to the other. Now, even though we have the common concern, we should also have differentiated responsibilities. How? Because, like I've said, first, others have already explored the environment and maximized the use of the environment. So contributing to mitigating cannot be said. And so, but again, we also have respective capabilities. The capability of, let's put Africa in general, the global south in general, cannot be the same of the global north, right? So that is how this framework is very important. So at all climate change negotiations or discussions, this is very key. It's very key for negotiating the limits and the contribution of states and blocks in having what they can have and what they can give. And so that is, so this is also based on historical contribution to climate change, like I've said. Because we know, the West, Europe, have been the major contributor of climate change. The first industrial revolution. And how much they contributed in polluting. There was no limit of pollution. There was a time that we have what they called, in Ghana we call it Apollo. I don't know how, when the atomic, the US bombed, what do you call it? Yes. Yes, and good. I mean, it affected the whole world. So in Ghana, there was a disease called Apollo. I don't know if how you call it. It affected the eye. So you see kind of discharge, reddish, and then it was rampant. It was what they called Apollo, which was attributed, I don't know, scientifically to the effect of those things. And it's for some time. If you heard of COVID came recently, right? I gave assignment to my trade class and asked them to, I'm not sure, so I said, nobody has researched, or I've not seen any research, let me put that way, on the effect of the disposal of the nose masks after COVID, on the environment. I've not heard or seen any research, at least from Ghana, or that there's been research to see how that disposal has impacted the environment and its repercussion in future. We don't know. We dispose them, we don't know how it is, and how it's going to affect us. So you see that others have explored the environment and benefited. At the same time, they say that now there is a limit to environmental exploitation, and that development must be a certain limit. Can we be on the same limit at this time? So are we going to go at the pace of the global north? So this is where this framework is very, very important, and when it comes to global governance or global negotiations. And the Paris Agreement, which actually was institutionalized climate governance through national determined contributions and the primary vehicle for mitigation. NDC, when I say NDC, those from Ghana, they know. Emma, that my paper I said when I talk about it, when I mention it, you don't mention the full name. People say, you. So Ghana, for instance, have an NDC, and I use Ghana as a case study of how we have transitioned into our current, environmental law. So very, very important, which requires that every country must, through a framework, spell out its nationally determined contributions in terms of adaptation and in terms of mitigation measures that we put in place. It's also a framework that requires that you must have, especially when talking about international trade, and then NDC and trade. That is where the interface. National commitment often include trade-related measures such as carbon pricing, renewable energy targets, and industrial decarbonization strategies. So in your national, I don't know how many countries here, if all your countries have your NDCs, you say I should not ask a question, so let me move on. It's a rhetorical question anyway. So you will see that these multilateral climate treaties are core to this intersection that I've said. It's very core to the intersection, and based on the explanation that I've given so far. So climate governance beyond treaties. How normally we know that climate governance, because we talk about governance, the processes, policies, frameworks. But can we have climate governance beyond treaties? Which is binding treaties. And indeed today, most development organizations or in most proposals you cannot talk about climate governance and restrict yourself to the existing frameworks or treaties. You must necessarily provide something on these other frameworks or other policy requirements. For example, environmental social governance frameworks. You must show your environmental, your social and governance disclosure regimes, such as the EU Corporate Sustainable Reporting Directive that affects global supply chain. So now in trade negotiations, in trade, so you have to indicate, your regime that on reporting of your, and this is non-negotiable, non-negotiable. Then also you should have what you call sustainable reporting. These are IFRS standards and private initiative like the Science-Based Target Initiative, which shapes corporate behavior and trade patterns. So you must have that. And then market mechanisms, your green financing, your sustainable bonds, and climate-aligned investment rules that influence capable capital allocation on altered trade flows. We know of money laundering and illegal financing of trade, other things. You require that sometimes you must even show the source of your market capital and how you are financing your trade. So climate governance now, extends far beyond state-to-state treaties. You should have your, like I said, ECG disclosures, regimes, and so on and so forth. Now, let's look at climate obligations versus trade commitments. Now, that is the balancing the acts. We have climate obligations. How do we balance that with our trade commitments? And this brings about some tensions. You need to, like I've said, you need to develop, you need to trade. You are liberalizing our markets. Investments, opportunities, want to invest, want to explore the environment. In Ghana, the issue now is galamsey, illegal mining. Now we are shifting our policy on mining. 2 days ago, the government of Ghana has issued a policy directive that by the end of this year, all foreign concessions on our mining that's ending must revert to local Ghanaians. Ghana has explored gold for years, 100 years. Recently, we became the top producer of gold in the world, overtaking South Africa. Meanwhile, what we get from gold revenue or royalties it has just been increased to between 5 to 10%. We used to have 5%, 3%. And the policy directive has shifted. We are trying to maximize our gold revenues, and there's already we have taken over one, the diamond mines, the second biggest mines in Ghana, has now given to a Ghanaian, albeit to a well-known entrepreneur who is related to the president. But Ghana has taken over, and the rest we are taking over. We are going to have pushbacks, from the international community, and already have started, pushing. We are going to have sabotage. We are going to have blackmail. They are going to blackmail Ghana. Everything will happen. But the policy is that by the end of the December, every concession that is ending must be reverted to our local, or some of the investors will say that it is discriminatory, right? Foreign investor, but that is not it. You must show certain. So there's climate obligations and trade commitments. What are your trade commitments? What they stand for, which you can explore or trade, at the same time observing climate conditions or obligations. So if you look at the NDCs, increases affect cross-border commerce. So the potential for conflict between trade and rules and climate regimes is intensifying, because the NDCs is your naturally determined commitment. And if you determine that and the trade volumes are coming, or you want to limit, how do you balance, or how do you change that? And then the impact of the, like I said, another obligation or challenge is the impact of the CBDRC, which has profound implications for trade governance, affecting expectations for technology transfer and financial support. So if you say that you are a developing country and you want to rely on the CBDR, and you say this is how much I can offer, it also may determine how much trade you have, how much investment that you have, or it can be undertaken in your territory. And also, there's also the challenge of regulatory intersections. States face the challenge of implementing domestic emission standards while respecting international trade and investment obligations. You see, because like I've said, an international trade or investment, we are dealing with partners across borders, basically how international trade is. And we are dealing with partners across borders, and who may also have their own investment interests or projections. So if I am coming into your country to invest or trade, and your domestic emissions requirement or standards are a certain level, and they do not agree with what I want to invest in or I want to trade in, how do I come in and how do we have the balance to trade? So you see this conflict are there. So you put your NDCs down there, and then your regulatory framework there, and the investor look at it as, I wanted to invest this much or this area of the economy, and because of this, I cannot do that. And it brings a lot of tension or conflict. So it's also a problem for developing countries particularly. So what are the trade measures for environmental and climate objectives? So we can look at this under climate-related trade instruments. What are the measures in place now to achieve environmental objectives? So we look at the climate-related instrument, which I've listed, the carbon, what we call the carbon border adjustment mechanism, the renewable energy subsidies, and product bans. These are climate-related instruments where you are required to undertake or engage in certain products, or give some renewable energy subsidies for certain kinds of activities, that would give regard to the environment. Then we have what we call the green industrial policy and WTO rules, subsidy rules, which sometimes is used as an exception to the WTO principles. Decarbonization of this may violate WTO rules if they distort trade or include local content requirements. Like I said, the exception national treatment and MFN, so on and so forth. The legal dilemma is industrial transformation requires state intervention, but trade law restricts certain protectionist measures. There's a paper I've done on industrial policy, in Ghana, and I asked for a new beginning, or an Africa in general, industrial policy, how we can, and you can't talk about industrial policy without the role of the state. That is the state intervention, taking hold of certain aspect of the industrialization or development, basically hinging on the small and medium scale support. So you have a state intervention that is supporting micro, small and medium enterprises. That may seem discriminatory, but the state must intervene in this regard. So it also becomes some environmental, measure. Now, like I said, ECG negotiations, ongoing effort to liberalize trade in environmental goods and services to lower the cost of climate technology. So then again, look at one of the measures is to look at the jurisprudence and regulatory space. What is happening? What does the regulatory space say, especially under international economic law? Again, Article 20 justification under WTO law. Like I said, measures may be justified if they are necessary for environmental objectives and are non-discriminatory. And there are key appellates body rulings that we can refer to. Then we go to sustainability and climate provisions in regional trade agreement. Now we coming down to the AFTA or the rest. Regional trade agreements, have become vital forum or what I call laboratories for innovation. It has become now regional trade agreements, which is giving rise to the spaghetti, bowl concept or phenomena. It has become a forum or laboratory for exploring innovations and integrating sustainability, deeply into the WTO system or the WTO framework. And you also see that modern RTAs are also expanding in scope. They are expanding in scope, unlike the former ones, to include some sessions or concerns on environmental protection and labor standards. And so they provide space for countries to experiment their trade regimes. So when you look at the evolution of RTs, like I said, as a laboratory for, and then we can also compare them to the European Union standard, which includes binding commitment on climate change mitigation, deforestation, and sustainable resource management, and requiring adherence to multilateral environmental agreement, what we call the MEAs, and labor rights. And of course, the US-Mexico-Canada agreement, which they used to call the NAFTA, is now the US-Mexico-Canada agreement, the NAFTA model, which integrates the environmental obligations into the core test, making them subject to state-to-state dispute resolution. So you will see that some regional agreements, existing regional agreements, already incorporate sustainability and climate change provisions. And so there's a standard that we can fall on, or there's a framework or a model that we can rely on. So now, comparative models. Let's come to the African context. If you looking at the provision, the regional trade agreement. Now in AFTA, like I've said, AFTA has been, how do I put it? Proactive in this instance, because in the preamble, it also recognizes sustainable development as a guiding principle. What do you learn from this? What do you learn from this? From the WTO, standard. WTO has it in its preamble, AFTA has this preamble. So it means that AFTA has been proactive. So in its preamble, it's also recognizes sustainability. And while current operational provisions are limited, future protocols on investment and competition are expected to embed climate relevant standards. So what we are saying is that even though the AFTA framework in its preamble also recognizes sustainable development as a principle, as a key principle in trade, we are saying that this should not be just like that. We must make sure that sustainability is incorporated or embedded in other protocols, in investment protocols, and almost everything that is related to environment or whatever that we do. That is the expectation that AFTA should not end, but we should be proactive. And I'm happy that this topic is handled at this important workshop. So investment and sustainability, we know the asset constraints. Traditional investor state dispute settlement has been criticized for potentially constrain a state's right to regulate for environmental purposes. Like I said, when we were in Pretoria, we were given assignments by Professor Ngo, was from Zambia. He was for the World Bank or something in 1 year. And he gave an assignment to compare the investment treaty between China, India, and the US, and how their frameworks are, and the various components. And then we did that as a whole assignment, let me say, assessments. And we wrote a memo on that. And in that, we're looking at the investment requirement that a country like India compared to China and compared to US. And you find, like I said in my last, that you will see that the requirements of environmental issues concerning the US model of framework and even India is way, way high. The standard is very high. Compared to China, there is no requirement of any environmental, I don't know what the state of it now, if it has been improved. But you did not have to certify any environmental concern before you can meet their investment agreements requirement. But India's one was to the extent that you even need to certify certain, local government issues. It's very, very, broad, very entailing. You need to get an Indian investment. You need to get a lot of issues of vulnerable people, your local governments, to everything. It's very detailed. And to talk about the US and other things, you need to be very strict about your environmental concern. So, investment and sustainability depends upon the parties you are negotiating with. The parties you are negotiating with. Some countries or some investors, they will leave it open. Others will have it as a strict requirement. But we must not fall for the evil of, because there's no environmental concern. That's why it's Ghana, for instance. If you come to Ghana, these Chinese have invaded our mineral resources. So what we call the galamsey, which is the illegal mining. Every village they are there. Everywhere, our water bodies are, So yesterday, when I all through, the only fish I've been eating all through dinner is tilapia. And before I asked the first day whether there is mining, whether there is mining in Tanzania and the water bodies here, because today to eat tilapia and in Ghana and certain fishes in Ghana, you are at risk. Yes, I was the keynote speaker at the University of Energy and Natural Resources at the Sunyani 3 years ago on artisan, mining and human rights, and I represented my dean, then Professor Raymond Atuguba of the University of Ghana Law School, who also was my supervisor as a keynote speaker, and for the 1 week we were talking about, and one of the presentations that was carried to all of us with evidence, was that the riskiest part of the Ghanaian fishes is even the bones, and this scientifically the bone. Those of you who chew them from Ghana, you chew and so, and deformities and a lot of things. So I asked if there's any water body here that is polluted before I eat the tilapia here. But I think I got a positive, whether it was true, I got a positive no. So I've been eating tilapia throughout, because I really eat tilapia in Ghana. So even last night I ate tilapia in the night because I was comfortable, So these Chinese guys, of course, with the connivance of Ghanaian counterparts, right, chiefs, and have polluted our water bodies. And Ghana is, in fact, struggling with illegal mining and the pollution of our water bodies. Very detrimental. Ghana has God's blessings of a lot of water bodies, and it's unfortunately about 70% of that polluted now. Yes, let's be frank, polluted, and it has become a political, question or political debate. It's part of the political campaigning too, whether you can fight galamsey or you cannot. So it's part of it this now, which is a very serious thing. So we want the investments, but how do we balance that with sustainability? How do you balance that with sustainability? So modern safeguards So we should have newer treaties that attempt to protect regulatory space, affirming the state's right to implement climate and environmental policy without facing excessive legal liability. We need to push towards that. Now, what the African context? I think that we'll get into the African context in terms of climate governance, sustainability, and peace. So, in African context, obviously, we're talking about the after. We have moved from the WTO, we come to the after. So, we call it the greenhouse industrialization and climate compatible trade. Africa wants to develop, we cannot develop without greenhouse emission. We should have massive infrastructure, and industrial development. That is right, that is non-negotiable. That is the aim. That is the objective. If after is not after that, if after is just about trading in, informal, capital trading, then that's not, then after is not going after the right thing. The after composition, after framework is to industrialize amongst ourselves, investors with the capital amongst Africans, trading and sharing capacity and capabilities amongst ourselves. So we are aiming at green industrialization, which means that we have to exploit the environment somehow. Green revolution, sustainable evolution or development. And how does it, play out in terms of climate and compatible trade? When we industrialize, we affect the climate, no two ways about that. Emissions are obvious. Exploration, water bodies will be affected. Trees and forestry and many things are affected. How do we, as African, after, how do we develop policy framework and protocols, and that would take into consideration our level of industrial revolution, at the same time, having compatibility with climate and trade related issues. So I talk about sustainable development and African integration. Of course, I'm interested in integration. We have to have strategic alignments. This means that we should have sustainable and inclusive development that guides the principles of the after. And that is also entailed in the after preamble, like I've said, sustainable development in the after. So this must be, our planning must have a strategic alignment with what we, the after itself, has envisaged or has proposed to do. And that means that we should have inclusive development, which means that we are talking about the whole of the sustainability framework, the 4 pillars. We should not concentrate on after it's about trade. It's about trade. It's about trade. No. I argue that we should have strategic alignment. The sustainable development concept and the after must be construed as just economic pathway. That's my argument, which I've summarized into this. It must just be the economic pathway. We must have a strategic alignment, which would certify, until that is done, I will not be satisfied with the preamble. It's not just by cliche, it's not just by saying it. It's not because the World Trade Organization preamble has it. So we have also copied and pasted. We must have strategic alignment. Continental vision. These are goals aligned with the African Union's Agenda 2063, which envisions an environmental sustainable economic transformation. Resilience necessity. Africa's vulnerability to climate change makes integrating resilience into trade policy an urgent priority to protect agriculture and supply chain. We should have that. We should be able to, whilst we develop, we should be able to make sure that our vulnerability does not become our standard. Always, we develop but also grow with the developments. Like I use the Tanzanian example. We don't want to have a situation where in future, sorry. Oh, sorry. What's happening?
Nice food.
Oh.
Oh, that's John Kennedy of Harvard. Oh, please.
You've closed the PowerPoint.
No, I have not closed it.
Down.
I think I have to. It's like my laptop is freeze, yeah?
It's like my laptop is actually freeze.
Oh, okay. Okay, sorry. So I was taking you back to something. We still have a situation where we will come to this. Sorry, quickly. We will come to this stage. If you look at, like I said, look at the maize farms in Tanzania that I've talked about. We should not have a situation of this picture that I have there, where we will be developing industrial development, and then we come to a stage that our farms, and the livelihood of the people will be compromised. This is not development. We may have the industries, have everything, and then we come to a situation where we think that we are trading, international trade. We are having investors who are occupying the space. Then our local people, the community people's livelihood will come to this stage where the climate will be affected. We have situation in Africa. This is not what we are looking for. So that I just took you back to what is? Okay. Where was I? I think I've left here. I'm beyond here, right? Okay.
Here, okay. Okay. So we must be sure that our resilience, vulnerability to climate change makes integrating this into trade policies an urgent priority to protect agriculture and supply chain. Because at the same time, if we don't protect the supply chain within our territories, Africa, we may have industries, but we have to have the raw materials and other things coming from other, continents or other places to feed our industries. So that's what I am saying here. Then, opportunities for climate smart growth. We should concentrate on green industrialization. The unified continental market can foster regional value chains in renewable energy, electric mobility, and climate resilient infrastructure. Critical minerals. Africa holds significant potential in minerals essential for energy transition, such as cobalt, lithium, and manganese. And recently, one of Ghana's top biggest discovery is lithium. And we are negotiating seriously with investors how much we can get. Now, Ghana has discovered huge lithium deposits, which is very close to in my region. That's the biggest. Ghana has everything, but every mineral. Now I'm sure our deposit could be, the biggest in Africa and beyond. And we are negotiating with investors for lithium is used in production of batteries and other things. So we must take hold of these significant minerals. How do we do that? We must make sure that we like I use Ghana's illegal mining. We are exploring, but at the same time depleting the environment. That is not a smart growth. It's not a smart growth. That you think that you are getting the resource, but at the same time you are compromising sustainability. We have defined sustainability that it must meet the need of the present and then the future generation. Let's have that at our back of our mind. It's not just developing today and having the high-rise buildings and nice infrastructure and everything. That is where you have actually take the boxes for sustainable development. So you must have a smart growth. Value addition. Proper governance, I have highlighted that, offers a pathway for African nations to move up the value chain rather than remaining mere exporters of raw materials. And that comes to governance.
That comes to governance. And that I've highlighted that is very important for me. Rule of law, democracy, equity, even distribution of not concentrated development in few. If you drive and go to every African countries, obviously, you can distinguish rural areas from urban areas, right? This is typical urban. They are the producers. And you see, you come to maybe Accra or Arusha, and this place is nice. But you just move away, a few kilometers away, and you see that most of the people are not impacted positively by our distance. So we cannot have, after in Accra, Arusha, Lagos, where in the capitals of this thing, and we have international investments and then building high, and then the people themselves, the vulnerable in the society, are not impacted. They don't even know about after. They don't know. The informal sector, they don't know. So it's about governance from the individual state nations before we can explore the benefit of the after. That is the holistic, that's what we should be looking at. Not a few trading here and there that we see is going on. We should be aiming at value addition and impacting the people through proper governance. So key challenges and risks to the whole of this triad I've spoken about. What are the key challenges that we envisage? The balancing act. How do you balance the responsibilities of the states? The need for urgent industrialization with global climate obligations, especially as many economies rely on carbon-intensive energy. We are moving away from hydro energy, we want to intensify. To intensify development, industrialization, we should explore the carbon, because we explore emissions and other things. So how do you balance the act? That is a challenge. How do we gain and then minimize the loss? How do we gain and minimize the loss? Obviously, the loss on the impact. We should be careful to balance the act. That is the challenge that we find. Then, green protectionism. Measures like the EU's, like I said, the CDM, goes to African exports.
Mic testing.
Okay. So I'm rounding up. So ask for one or two questions, or those who have questions. Then the policy space is also obvious as challenging for us. There is a critical need to safeguard the regulatory space required for climate compatibility industrial policy without facing trade penalties. Yes, there are requirements, WTO requirements, after requirement, but how do we balance with our industrial policies? So future after negotiations, I say that in our investment protocol, a continental protocol could protect the regulatory space for climate policy, mitigating risks associated with traditional investment treaties. In terms of the protocol on competition and IP, the most expert is here. Competition policy can target anti-competitive practices in carbon-heavy sectors, while IP rules can facilitate the diffusion of adaptation technologies. Digital trade. We have talked about all these concepts here in our prior or previous lectures. So the key tensions and debates in the trade climate is what I've put across here. Trade liberalization versus environmental protection. These are the debates. So you can pick, as a researcher, as a student, you can pick some of these things and look at it. Trade liberalization versus environmental protection. What you call the sovereignty versus natural resource. Green protection and disguised restrictions is also an area that you can explore. Legitimacy of unilateral measures. North-South tensions and equity. So future directions and emergence, global carbon pricing and trade. We have proliferation of mechanisms that are increasing, adopting emission trading schemes and carbon taxes, and so on and so forth. Then standardization and harmonization is also an area that we have to look at in this discussion. And then climate-aligned trade initiative. We must be very, very particular and intentional about this. When we want to take initiatives, how does it align with climate requirement? And then, of course, digitalization and innovation. In Ghana, for instance, in our gold board and gold trading, what we call traceability of where the gold is coming from, whether it's coming from the illegal mining or it's coming from, in trading of gold and minerals, traceability is very, very important to see whether we should trade with you in this minerals or this product because of how it is mined or how it is produced. Is very important. And then governance intersections. These are the core areas that we can talk. So my conclusion is that on the evolving trade I'll talk about, the interconnectedness of these three, concepts, trade, sustainable, and climate governance, form a complex and evolving trade that increasingly shapes global economic policy. And there's necessary adaptation. The urgency of climate change demands that trade rules adapt to accommodate environmental objectives without undermining development. Not negotiable. Spaces for innovation. Whilst WTO provides doctrinal tools, the rules, regional RTAs and domestic legislation are critical space for policy innovation. WTO gives you broad rules and other things, but domestically and regionally, we must have to have our own way of managing our climate change requirement. So requirement for legal and institutional coordination. Effective governance requires coherence across legal regimes and the integration of sustainability at all levels of policy making, and so on and so forth. On this note, I will end here. Thank you. And there are any questions or
Thank you very much. Thank you. Congrats, Prof. Give me 5. Thanks. So, because the presentation has been so excellent, you're going to have 30 minutes of questions. Yeah, so it's not yet done, because I'm sure you have weighted the intellectual appetite more than the appetite of the stomach. Yeah, so people are willing to sacrifice everything just to ask questions. So what we're going to do, we're going to have 30 minutes questions, and after that we're going to have a tea break of 15 minutes. Yeah, okay? So you see, so the most important thing will take much more time, which is the intellectual appetite. Then the other appetites will take 15 minutes. So, as our tradition, 3 rounds of questions. You ask 3 questions, and then he answers, and then 3 again. And then as he will be answering, some of the material that he ran through very fast, he can refer back to them. All right? Okay, here we go. The first 3 hands. Okay, we have the first 3 in that corner. 1, 2, 3. Yeah.
Thank you very much for your presentation, Prof. You mentioned stakeholders, and you listed indigenous people as some of the stakeholders in trade, climate, sustainability, governance. I agree with you in theory that is the case. However, in practice, you find that they are the ones that bear the cost of policies created by other people. And this is something that my government, Botswana, has suffered time and time again. We've had bad publicity when it comes to issues like this. So, in your opinion, how can an African state advance its climate governance and sustainable trade policies without placing pressure on indigenous peoples and their ancestral lands?
All right. Thank you so much for that wonderful presentation. I'm building on her submission or her question. The aspect of access to benefits has come out to be a key issue, especially when the aspects of free play and informed consent are involved. Now, mine goes to the aspect of carbon markets as they are arising. As of yesterday, there was the launch of the global carbon markets in Korea. And my issue is, when it comes to the conflict between the global north and global south, the global north are the key players, the key producers of the greenhouse gases and emissions. But the African bloc is used as an offset because the global north produces more while the African bloc does not produce that much. So the aspect of offset and the benefits being brought as a result of that offset do not go down to the benefits as she explains. And now my question is, how best can the frameworks in respect of climate change, climate mitigation, and climate finance, how can they best be tailored to make sure that the benefits arising therefrom come down to the communities, the key mitigators? Thank you.
Thank you for the presentation, Prof. My question is hinged to the recent, can I say recent, in January 2026, the European Union actually activated the carbon border adjustment mechanism on all imports into the EU, covering aluminium, steel, fertilizers, amongst a host of all other goods. And I am looking at the AFCFTA and maybe individual countries, and especially my country as well, as we are actually deep into mining and also into industrialization, which is actually based on those fossil fuels. So what's your take? Is the activation of the carbon border adjustment by the EU, can we consider it as a catalyst to greening or as a green trade barrier? I want you to expand the intersectionality of climate change and trade, especially when we have our AFCFTA actually taking off. And how does the AFCFTA negotiate this, considering that whatever is actually being required also by the EU, it is going to be costly to most African nations. Thank you.
Thank you, Prof. You can proceed.
Yeah, so, I mean, the discussion is Global South. I want to just put it this way. We're discussing this whole frameworks or these topics in the concept of Global South, Global North intersection, and also the whole of the development at our own pace, and how we can leverage on our resources, our challenges to meet our own needs without compromising on the future. So, taking it from the question of the vulnerable people, indigenous people, and the cost to them, I agree with you. That's the point I was making, that at all times in the development paradigm, in the trajectory of development, whether you're considering from the perspective of trade or from climate change, climate change ecosystem is a whole ecosystem of trade. Like, we come back to the gentleman's question on the climate change infrastructure and the tension or transition. So it's a whole trading system, it's a whole trading arena on its own, when it comes to green financing, transition, and carbon trading. So what we are saying is that on the basis of the AFTA, we must negotiate and we must have our own priorities based on from our own development paradigm and the pace. How to negotiate with Europe, with the South, with the US, is based on our own objectives and how we understand our development. And I am saying that our development must, from this perspective of how our vulnerables or many of our people will benefit today, and not just for the few. So, on that score, whatever Europe is trading in, when it comes to the interface with Africa, we must present our best foot forward in terms of what Africa's industrial development trajectory or projections are. If we think that the trade in carbon amongst the West is not what at the pace of our development, we must develop and we have the resources, for Christ's sake. We have the resources to develop at our own pace in terms of carbon trading, in terms of emission management, in terms of everything. There's a standard for emission, in the world. But how is Africa's projections able to meet that? In fact, we are not even emitting in terms of percentage. If you put it side by, we are not emitting. We are not. So that is even that is not even non-starter. We are not even emitting. In terms of if you put at the percentages of emission, we are still not emitting anything. So to put it across that we must consider our own trajectory, the standards of what, that's why I asked the question, when Africa says of sustainable development in AFTA, what is our conceptual framework? What's our understanding? Is it because the WTO has used it, so we are also using it? What's our understanding of sustainable development? And how do we categorize the process and the stages to our sustainable development? That is we are balancing the act. It must be at our own pace. And I will continue to say that we cannot rely on the thresholds, even though there's a rigor or international framework. But it also allows our domestic and our RTAs to fashion out whatever is suitable for Africa to develop. And like I say, we are not a meeting. We can develop at a certain pace without intentionally or compromising the environment. It depends on how we trade amongst ourselves and also capacitate our investors or our traders or our people to be able to negotiate. And more also, the point is about negotiation. It comes back to negotiation. How are we able to negotiate even at the international forums based on the CBDR? How are we able to negotiate? What was our like we said the last time, how are we prepared? What are our resources, our capabilities even to negotiate some of this? The technical know-how, do we have that? I think Prof was saying that sometimes we even have to rely on outside expertise to negotiate for us. And I think Professor Kakwa is here, he will tell you the things that African countries go through when some of these negotiations go through. What are the expertise? We even rely on outsiders, Europeans, to even negotiate and draw the technical papers for us. And sometimes we are even not savvy with the technicalities and what entails negotiating. And on the sides of the discussion yesterday, most Africans in Gulf, we have this kind of concept of all know all. One person, he's a technical person and a consultant for everything. Am I right? One person is a consultant, technical person for Africa negotiation. He's a technical person for everything. I know one or two in Africa. Every forum, every negotiation, they are experts. And they know everything, consult everything they are consulting. So I think that for me, it's about how we're able to negotiate, how we're able to keep the balancing between our expectations and what entails for us in the future. I'm sure I've done something small for today's question.
The next three questions. Okay, we have Prof. Regis. Okay, we have my lady, and who is the third one? So we give, okay, proceed. The third one will be identified soon. Proceed, Prof.
Thank you very much. Thanks for that wonderful presentation. So, first of all, some clarifications. I think some developing countries and LDCs, as you know, have been challenging the CBAMs for the reasons what they are. They are unilateral measures, right? They are trade measures that have been taken unilaterally by the EU, and the UK has contemplated, I think they are also going to be introducing their own. The US has also contemplated, but the act hasn't been passed, but they have used other green industrial policy mechanism. So these are unilateral measures. They didn't, and the African country group has opposed that. I mean, they have challenged that at the WTO. Even though, as you said yourself, they were not really, they didn't take into account the common but differential TBDR into account when they enacted this. And also this challenges the WTO special and differential treatment provisions, which say you cannot, developing countries should be able to also integrate at their own pace. So my question now is, given the fact that the EU took unilateral measures and African countries are already suffering, such as Malawi. I mean, you know that Malawi has the aluminum of Malawi, majority of Malawi export in aluminum ends up in the European market. So they are going to be more affected by the measures. So given what we know now, I think the export restrictions of these raw materials could be our approach to resistance as African continent. we might, among ourselves, decide not to export these raw materials as a collective resistance project. And some of our African countries have already started imposing export restriction. Even the WHO rules permit that. You can restrict export for the reason of you just mentioned, right? Environmental protection reasons, right? So you might use that if it's challenged at the WTO, there are rooms for defense. But as a continent, we might use that as a leverage for these unilateral actions that are being taken and jeopardizing our economy in terms of, extraction of natural. Also, because African countries are trying to industrialize, this also force them to add value to these natural resources on the continent and trade it as we're adding value to the raw materials, right? So by restricting the export of these materials, we're actually encouraging the transformation on the continent. So there's a procedure that there is a room for us to address some of these challenges. So this was my contribution and your views. I want to hear your view about that as well.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Professor, for the excellent presentation. I think what I wanted to ask has also been hinted by Professor who has just spoken. Because my question really stems from the fact that the reality on ground in the African countries, we are facing real side effects of climate change, very harsh change in climate patterns. In Uganda, for example, the last 3 years, we've seen, enormous consequences. The raining patterns have changed. The high temperatures, which were not the case in the previous years, are very real. And I just listening to you, and there's so many protocols, there's so many treaties that over the years we've been sort of, as an African continent, participatory to. They don't have a real impact on ground. I see that we are witnessing more harsh realities of climate changes as opposed to the different protections that we should be gaining. So it took me to think, like, for example, when you talk about the intrusion of so many Chinese into our water bodies and our resources, that's the real reality also in Uganda. Like all sectors, we have exploitation, environmental degradation, and even some of the restrictions, for example, investment licenses, because of the vice of corruption, you see that even investment licenses are granted without due process being followed, and as a result, the local communities, are affected greatly. So how can we really move from the general principles in some of these, treaties and legal frameworks to binding, binding commitments that can be implemented? I think that one of the ways to look at is the political will to have these all commitments being implemented on ground. So I think that's the conversation, but we have the legal frameworks. We have so many treaties. AFTA is now coming, but if we don't, spend energy in seeing how we can translate this, the reality on ground is completely different. Thank you.
The third question. Okay, I can take advantage then of asking the third question.
Right.
Prof, how can we make sure that after take advantage of the regional extractive activities that are going on? In this case, look at what we call a Lowito Corridor. I don't know if you're aware of the Lowito Corridor. To put a bit of context, is that there is a global gateway fund from EU, which is the EU's foreign policy, and they are trying to extract raw materials from Congo, Zambia, Angola, Mozambique. So they are creating what they call the Lowito Corridor. And the EU has passed even an act of parliament, they call it the Critical Raw Materials Act. And if you read that act, it sounds like it's Scramble for Africa 2.0, because they don't refer to Africa as a main actor. They refer to China and others, but no Africa. So can AFTA get on this stage and influence the African foreign policy in protecting and securing the natural resources. Because, like what you mentioned, the Anthropocene, where man becomes the determinant of all, then this time we are saying not man, but Europe. Thank you.
Yes, I always take pragmatic approach to answer some of these questions, because the questions themselves come to perspective, understanding, and it's kind of a background, issues. So I take pragmatic understanding because to begin with Elvis, I'm not familiar with the protocol you're talking about, but for me to develop or to reach a stage where we have extractive industry, regime for Africa would be difficult. We know I started with integration last time, and you know where the European integration has gotten to the European Union, economic union. We are at the base, like I established here, of a free trade area. It has its own restrictions, it has its own what it can do. So we always at this time cannot compare the pace at which Europe is going with some of these frameworks and their development in terms of economic and management of their resources. Because I've established that we are the base of free trade area. We've not gone anywhere, in terms of the after. So basically, to get to that level of integration where resource integration and this thing, we just have to migrate, with the speed of Africans integration, especially economic integration. It will take some time to reach there, but we can always take a cue, and especially when we are drafting sector policies, any sector policies or protocols, or we can look at that. So that would be my response. And to Prof, I think that the dichotomy here, is about need and capability. Notwithstanding the EU unilateral measures, whatever they take or whatever is a kind of because they don't have our interest basically. Because businessmen naturally have, when even you think that they are negotiating in good faith, it's not just like that. It's about their interest. So whatever they put forward is not because they like you or because they want you to benefit. In this way, if you put that, just opposing that with the European Union and how they go about their things in terms of their measures, in terms of their concessions, in terms of this thing, sometimes it's arbitrary, but because they have the unified legal system, and have also advanced in certain stage, we are not able to compete. I mean, that one we cannot fight it. In terms of when it comes to arm's length negotiation, they have certain things that they can do sometimes behind the scenes, even to explore or exploit our own membership in Africa. So basically, I want to look at it from the needs and capability. What are our needs? What are our resources, the capabilities? And what are the measures can we offer or concessions can we offer, even amongst ourselves in terms of even carbon trading, in terms of emission? Because even between two countries, say Ghana and Togo, right? Recently there's a situation of Ghana and Burkina Faso and tomatoes, right? Yeah, even tomato, exports between Ghana and tomato, between the two countries which share border, right? Tomato exportation has become a challenge, and there has been death even on the borders. Traders have been killed between Ghana and Burkina Faso. So we have a practical. Sometimes we should not discuss Africans' problems theoretically. They are practical problems that we have to confront pragmatically again. Otherwise, some of these things may not. And then I think that application of rules, it's also come in the context of building commitments. We have the rules, but how can we sometimes even have national laws, or how can we as individual countries apply? Because some of the rules are just omnibus the effort after, by its application or domestic policies can work better, before we can integrate. So depending upon the commitment, the binding commitment that we have in the after, under the after. And let's we talk about the competition law issue. And I was made to know after the lecture that it's not binding. So what are the binding commitments in these rules in themselves? So at certain points, there could be national policies or national. It's not about, like you said, I agree with you, not about frameworks, protocols, and building protocols and putting them down like the competition policy that was told that cannot be enforced. But what is the essence of the pacta sunt servanda principle, right? What is the essence of that? So I do understand it, but that same way. So if political will, like I also explained, the political will is not like the way to sit and negotiate. It's about the way to give the resources, allow the technocrat, allow the professionals, allow the system to work. If our countries can have the political will and give the resources, and again, I think to a previous question, we have the resources. We have the resources, and we can develop it and then evolve it with our technology, and we have the means also to acquire some of the technologies. Most of the brilliant innovators and these things are Africans. I mean, classic. We Africans, forget about those in diaspora. But the experts, the know-how, we have them in Africa. What we need, we only have to build the laboratories that I talk about, laboratory of innovation. We have to evolve them and build a laboratory of innovators and then bring them together under the auspices of AFTA. Prof. Amir yesterday says that up to now, we don't even have the list of experts for competition law on the AFTA website. Is that right? You don't even have the list of the experts. Are we saying that we don't have arbitrators, competent arbitrators in Africa that we can list them on the AFTA website? Up to now, we don't have them, like he said. So how do we leverage on these, the resources, the human resources? And that is key. We can do all of these things when we have the human resources. And we have them, we have trained them, we've been sponsored, they are there. But how to bring them together and through the political will, so that we can have them lead some of these innovations so that we can liberate ourselves from this colonial attachment to other protocols or whatever that. Even the UN FCC, it's just like I said, it's a framework to guide further development of protocols. So how have we also even leveraged, apart from the international protocols, the Kyoto protocols, the Paris? Now, even the NDCs, like the Prof said, the NDCs, if you want to take a census here, how many Africans have the NDCs, and how many African NDCs even speaks to their countries, what they have and what they can do. If you look through, and maybe we have time to go through, Prof, maybe we have to do a paper and maybe look into those NDCs, if they actually also speak to the requirements and the national needs in this thing. These are the challenges that are obvious and practical for us to tackle. Thank you.
Much? I thought we had done. Anyway.
Okay. All right. Thank you. Okay. Thank you. It's just a comment. I want to speak this from a practical point of view. I own a very small gold mine in Zimbabwe, very small piece of land. And I want to speak this in relation to what my sister over there has said in terms of what has been called indigenous people and the language that we have been given to say these are illegal miners. Okay. It's a language that we have been given largely coming from Europe, our colonizers. When you compare the manner that I got my mining license, it took me almost 3 years. But when you look at the Chinese investors, our governments, whether they're coming from Zambia, Ghana, Nigeria, Uganda, there's a dedicated investment body that is compelled to do ease of investment. So the Chinese and other investors, they come there within a week they have got the mining license. You come to us, the so-called indigenous people or illegal miners, takes you 3, 5, 7 years just to get a license. Now, where are these minerals located? Largely where the so-called indigenous communities are. Therefore, if these investors come in, they exploit the resources, they do not build schools, there is no infrastructure, there are no hospitals. They also pollute the environment. There is no new mechanism of, if it's gold, everybody is using mercury. So, if we then empower and do away and make it very easy for our own people to get the mining licenses, what does that do? It then empowers the government to bring in a system to assist to ensure that when they are disposing whatever consumables that they are using in the processing and extraction of gold, it is done in a proper manner that then protects the environment. So if we are not going to make interventions as African governments to empower our own people, reform the laws, make it easy for our own people to then enjoy whatever it is that is God-given in their own communities, becomes quite problematic. Number 2, there is what I call piercing the trade veil. Piercing the trade veil. What we call the Chinese investments. If you pierce what is happening there, behind them is the Chinese government. So they exploit your lithium, take it to China, and it is given to the custody of the Chinese government. Yet our own government, they just look at this person as an investor, but the real investor, so to speak, is the Chinese government. So when you're talking of the Lobito corridor, it's a very disheartening aspect because there's no reaction coming from the identified countries. So we need to be very pragmatic, take leadership. When you look at after and you realistically look at what is happening, it may be overtaken by events when you're looking at all these trade issues. I'm just highlighting the issues to say we need to provide practical solutions that do benefit Africans. Talk about illegal miners, artisanal miners. It's a language that has been developed over the years that we have accepted. Similar thing when you look at your small to medium enterprises, the so-called informal sector. We are always talking there is an informal sector, we need to formalize it. In a similar fashion, once you identify illegal miners, come up as a government with a system. How do we formalize these so-called illegal miners? Then you can control the manner in which they do the mining, and the resources will not find their ways to the black market. They come back to the country. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Yes, it's a comment and a brief comment. I agree with you on many scores. Like I've said, that I am a very calculated optimist of the after. I mean, after is a baby of the AU, right? I mean, what is the financing for AU? We know, we have said it here. So basically, if you translate, what is the financing for after? Behind these things, practically, pragmatically, is that the Chinese and these people are also sponsoring. If they are sponsoring AU, basically it means that they are sponsoring after, because that's your baby. And in many ways, they have a hand in many of our governmental decisions and policies and national destiny. So like I use a Ghanaian example, we know the hard rule in expropriation. I'm not for expropriation without compensation. Basically, in Ghana, the hard rule is even incorporating our constitution, Article 20, about expropriation. And so we should find a way to win ourselves from these European, Chinese, Eurocentric by taking charge of our resources, democratically, by rule of law, through the legal infrastructure, like Ghana is doing. Expropriation, it must be done according to, the hard rule, how to expropriate. And if it's incorporated in your law, it's easy to do that. And we, as I said, found in our laws, Article 20 of our Constitution, and many our investment law. So, to say that something is illegal is not because of whether you're doing it at small scale or large scale. It's because you have not followed the rules of engagement. That's as simple as that. And so there must be kind of a privilege for indigenous or local people to kind of an easy way out. Also, bureaucracy is part of it. And to go through bureaucracy to pay for your way out, that's what it means. And these people have a way of breaking the bureaucratic channels is by way of paying their way out. But the small-scale miner doesn't have the means to pay his way out. And so your documents, your documentations are kept there because you cannot pay your way out. And these people are able to do that. That is what I think we have to dismantle, as Africans, so that we can, otherwise, these discussions will be a circus. Thank you.
Let's give him his flowers, please.